The winter wind moved across the wide prairie like a living thing that night. It howled through the tall grass and rattled the wooden walls of the small ranch house as if trying to force its way inside. Snow had begun to fall before sunset, but now the storm had grown stronger. Thick white flakes filled the dark sky, covering the land in silence. Out on the lonely ranch lived a man named Silas Whitaker. Silas was a quiet rancher who had spent most of his life on that land. His home sat far from town, surrounded by empty fields, old fences, and the slow creaking of the barn in the cold wind. Most nights were peaceful. But this night felt different. Silas sat near the small fire inside his cabin, mending a worn leather glove. The flames crackled softly, giving the only warmth in the room. Outside, the storm pushed against the windows. The rancher lifted his eyes toward the door. Something had made him pause. At first he thought it was only the wind. But then he heard it again. A sound. Faint. Small. Almost like crying. Silas slowly set the glove down on the table. He listened. The wind roared again, shaking the roof of the house. For a moment there was nothing. Then it came again. A weak little sob carried through the storm. Silas stood up quickly. Out here on the prairie, no one should have been outside on a night like this. Not a traveler. Not a neighbor. And certainly not a child. Silas grabbed his lantern and pulled on his heavy coat. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and the cold air rushed inside like a wave of ice. The storm hit him immediately. Snow blew across the yard, swirling around the barn and fences. The lantern light barely pushed back the darkness. Silas stepped forward, his boots crunching into the deep snow. He listened carefully. At first he heard only the wind. Then, another cry. This time it came from the barn. Silas moved quickly across the yard, shielding the lantern with his hand. The big wooden barn stood dark and silent except for the loose boards rattling in the wind. He pushed the barn door open. The hinges groaned. Inside, the smell of hay and horses filled the air. The lantern light flickered across the wooden beams and stalls. For a moment, Silas saw nothing. Then he heard a small movement above him. A rustle in the hayloft. Silas lifted the lantern higher. "Hello?" he called gently. There was no answer. Only a frightened breath. Silas climbed the wooden ladder slowly, careful not to startle whoever might be hiding there. When he reached the top, the lantern light finally revealed the small figure curled into the corner of the hay. It was a little girl. She looked no older than 7 or 8. Her thin dress was torn and dusty. Snow clung to her dark hair, and her small hands were shaking as she held them close to her chest. Her eyes were wide with fear. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Silas crouched down slowly so he would not seem frightening. "Well now," he said softly. "You shouldn't be out here tonight." The girl said nothing. She only watched him with tired eyes. Silas gently placed his coat over her shoulders. The thick wool swallowed her tiny frame. "You'll freeze out here," he said quietly. The girl looked down at the coat, then back at him. "Do you have a name?" Silas asked. For a long moment she stayed silent. Then finally she whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind outside. "Clara." Silas nodded. "Well, Clara," he said kindly, "you're safe now?" He carefully helped her down the ladder and led her across the snowy yard toward the warm cabin. Inside, the firelight wrapped around them like a blanket. Silas poured a small cup of warm milk and handed it to her. The girl held the cup with trembling hands, drinking slowly while staring into the flames. She looked as though she had not slept in many nights. Silas pulled a chair closer to the fire for her. "You can stay here tonight," he told her. "We'll figure everything out in the morning." Clara nodded quietly. For a long time, the cabin was silent except for the crackling fire. The storm outside continued to roar across the prairie. Silas thought the child had fallen asleep. But suddenly Clara spoke again. Her small voice was soft and uncertain. "Mister." Silas looked up. "Yes." The girl hesitated, staring at the floor as if afraid of the answer. Then she whispered the words that made the room suddenly feel colder. "My father comes every night." Silas frowned slightly. He assumed she was speaking about memories or dreams. "Is that so?" he asked gently. Clara nodded slowly. Her eyes moved toward the dark window. "He comes when it gets dark." Silas followed her gaze. Outside, the storm still covered the land in white silence. Then the girl said something that made the rancher feel a strange chill crawl up his spine. "But, my father died." The fire cracked loudly in the quiet room. And somewhere far outside, the barn door slowly creaked in the wind. Cloud with snow. Morning came slowly to the quiet ranch. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the land covered in a deep blanket of white snow. The prairie looked peaceful now, glowing softly under the pale winter sun. But inside the small ranch house, Silas Whitaker had not slept well. The little girl's words from the night before stayed in his mind. "My father comes every night." Silas had heard many strange things during his years on the frontier. Storms, lonely travelers, frightened children. Life on the prairie could make people say things they did not truly mean. Still, something about the way the girl had said those words felt different. It had not sounded like imagination. It had sounded like certainty. Silas stepped outside early that morning to check on the animals. The air was cold and sharp, and his breath formed clouds in front of him as he walked across the snow-covered yard. As he passed the barn, he noticed something that made him stop. Footprints. Small ones. They led from the barn door to the house, the tracks Clara had made when he brought her in the night before. But beside them were other marks. Longer ones. Older. Almost covered by the falling snow. Silas studied them carefully. They might have been nothing. The wind could twist snow into strange shapes. Animals sometimes wandered close to the barn during storms. Still, the rancher felt uneasy. He finished feeding the horses and returned to the house. Inside, the warm smell of coffee filled the air. Clara sat quietly at the small wooden table. Silas had given her one of his old blankets to wrap around her shoulders. The thick wool nearly reached the floor when she stood. She looked healthier this morning, though her eyes still carried a tired sadness that no child should have known. Silas placed a plate of bread and eggs in front of her. "You need to eat," he said gently. Clara nodded and began to eat slowly. For a while neither of them spoke. Finally Silas sat down across from her. "Clara," he said kindly, "do you remember where your home is?" The girl lowered her eyes. "Yes." Silas leaned forward slightly. "Would you be able to show me?" Clara hesitated. Then she gave a small nod. So later that morning the two of them set out across the snowy prairie. Silas saddled his horse and lifted Clara up in front of him. The little girl held tightly to the saddle horn as the horse moved slowly along the frozen path. The land stretched wide and quiet around them. Bare trees stood like dark skeletons against the bright snow. Old fences poked through the drifts, half buried by the storm. After nearly an hour of riding, Clara pointed toward a line of thin trees ahead. "There," she whispered. Silas guided the horse toward the trees. Soon the shape of a small cabin appeared between the branches. But as they drew closer, Silas felt his stomach tighten. Something about the place felt wrong. The cabin looked old and forgotten. The door hung crooked on its hinges. Snow had piled against the walls. The windows were dark and dusty. No smoke rose from the chimney. No footprints marked the ground. Silas climbed down from the horse and helped Clara to the ground. The girl stood quietly, staring at the cabin. "This is where you live?" Silas asked. Clara nodded slowly. Silas pushed the door open. It creaked loudly. Inside, the air smelled cold and stale. Dust covered the table and chairs. The fireplace held only old gray ashes. A broken cup lay on the floor. It was clear no one had lived there for a long time. Silas looked around the empty room, confusion filling his mind. "How long have you been alone here?" he asked gently. Clara's voice was very small. "A long time." Silas knelt beside her. "Where is your father, Clara?" The girl stared at the floor. "He died." Silas felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. "When?" "Before the snow came." Silas stood slowly and looked around the quiet cabin again. No food. No firewood. No sign that anyone had cared for the child. How had she survived this long? As they stepped outside again, a wagon rolled slowly along the nearby road. An older man driving it noticed them and stopped. "Morning," the man called. Silas nodded. "Morning." The man squinted toward Clara. "Well now, I'll be." He climbed down from the wagon looking surprised. "That little girl there, that's Thomas Bell's daughter, isn't it?" Silas glanced at Clara. "You knew her father?" The man nodded. "Sure did." His face grew serious. "Good man. Worked hard. But he passed away months ago." Silas felt the cold wind brush against his face. "Months?" he repeated. "Fell from his horse one night on the road," the man explained sadly. "Broke his neck, they said. Sheriff found him the next morning." The rancher looked down at Clara. The girl stood quietly beside him, staring at the ground. The old man shook his head slowly. "Poor child, didn't know what became of her." Silas placed a protective hand on the girl's shoulder. "She'll stay at my ranch for now," he said. "That's good," the man replied. "Real good." After the wagon rolled away, Silas helped Clara back onto the horse. They rode toward the ranch in silence. The sun had begun to sink low by the time they reached home. The prairie turned golden and quiet. That evening, Clara sat again beside the warm fire. The ranch felt a little less empty with the child there. Silas placed another log into the fire. "You're safe here," he told her gently. Clara looked into the flames for a long time. Then she spoke in a quiet voice. "He'll come tonight." Silas turned slightly. "Who will?" Clara lifted her eyes toward the dark window. "My father." The rancher felt a strange chill move down his spine again. "But Clara," he said softly, "you told me your father passed away." The girl nodded calmly. "Yes." Silas frowned slightly. "Then what do you mean he comes every night?" Clara looked back at the fire. Her small voice carried a quiet certainty that made the room feel suddenly colder. "He comes after the moon rises." Silas said nothing. Outside, the wind had begun to rise again across the silent prairie. And far away in the darkness, a barn door slowly creaked open. Crescent moon. The night grew quiet after the fire burned low. Outside the ranch house, the prairie rested under a pale moon. The storm clouds had passed, leaving the sky clear and cold. Snow stretched across the land like a silver blanket. Inside the cabin, Silas Whitaker sat in his chair near the dying fire. The room was dim now, lit only by the soft orange glow of the last embers. Across the room, little Clara Belle slept on a small bed Silas had made for her near the wall. At least that was what Silas believed. But the rancher could not sleep. The child's words from earlier still echoed in his thoughts. "He comes after the moon rises." Silas leaned forward and added another log to the fire. The flames rose again, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. He told himself the girl had only been frightened. Children who lost their parents sometimes imagine things. Grief could make the mind wander into strange places. Something about Clara's voice had not sounded like fear. It had sounded like truth. Hours passed slowly. The fire crackled softly. The wind brushed against the walls of the house. Somewhere in the distance a lone coyote cried across the frozen prairie. Then suddenly, Silas heard something. A faint sound outside. He lifted his head. At first it seemed like nothing more than the wind. But then he heard it again. A slow creak. Wood moving. Silas stood up. His eyes turned toward the dark window. For a moment the rancher remained perfectly still, listening. Then another sound followed. A soft thud. As if someone had stepped onto the frozen ground. Silas moved quietly toward the door. He picked up his lantern and lit the wick. The small flame flickered inside the glass, pushing back the darkness. Before opening the door, he glanced toward Clara's bed. The girl was sitting up. Her small figure was still wrapped in the blanket. Her eyes were wide. "He's here," she whispered. Silas felt a strange chill crawl across the back of his neck. "You stay inside," he told her gently. Clara nodded but did not look afraid. That was the strange part. She looked as if she had expected this. Silas opened the door slowly. Cold air rushed into the cabin. The night outside was quiet and bright beneath the moon. Snow glittered across the ranch yard like scattered diamonds. Silas stepped outside, holding the lantern high. The wind had calmed now. The world felt almost too still. His boots pressed deep into the fresh snow as he walked across the yard. For a moment he saw nothing. Then he noticed something near the barn. Footprints. Silas walked closer. The lantern light revealed a clear trail pressed into the snow. Large footprints. A man's. They came from the direction of the trees beyond the ranch. And they led straight toward the barn. Silas felt his heartbeat slow and heavy in his chest. Someone had been here. Not hours ago. Not earlier in the evening. Just moments ago. The rancher followed the tracks carefully. The barn door stood slightly open, swaying gently in the cold breeze. Silas pushed it wider. The hinges groaned loudly in the quiet night. Inside, the horses shifted in their stalls, snorting softly at the sudden light. Silas lifted the lantern. The barn looked normal. Hay bales stacked neatly. Tools hanging on the wall. The ladder leading to the loft. Nothing seemed disturbed. But the footprints continued across the dirt floor. They led toward the far corner of the barn. Silas followed them slowly. Then suddenly, they stopped. Right in the middle of the barn floor. As if the person had simply vanished. Silas lowered the lantern, studying the ground carefully. No other tracks led away. No sign of anyone hiding. Only silence. The horses shifted nervously again, their hooves scraping against the wood. Silas stood there for a long moment, confused. Finally he turned and walked back toward the house. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he crossed the yard again. When he stepped inside the cabin, Clara was still awake. She looked at him quietly. "He came, didn't he?" she asked. Silas set the lantern on the table. For a moment he did not answer. Then he nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. Clara lowered her eyes toward the blanket in her lap. "He always comes." Silas sat down in his chair again, staring at the fire. Something was wrong. Someone had clearly been on the ranch. But why would a stranger sneak into the barn in the middle of the night? And why had Clara expected it? Silas looked toward the small girl. "Clara," he said gently, "when your father comes, does he talk to you?" The girl shook her head slowly. "No." "Then what does he do?" Clara thought for a moment. "He just watches." Silas frowned. "From where?" The girl lifted her small hand and pointed toward the barn outside. "From there." The rancher turned his head toward the dark window. The barn stood silent beneath the moonlight. But now Silas knew something he hadn't known before. Someone was coming to his ranch in the middle of the night. And whoever it was, had been doing it for a long time. Outside, the cold wind moved softly across the prairie. And in the far shadows near the tree line, a dark figure stood watching the ranch house. Crescent moon. The next morning arrived cold and pale across the prairie. A thin layer of frost covered the ranch yard, and the air carried that deep winter silence that came after a long night. Inside the cabin, Silas Whitaker stood by the window, staring toward the barn. The footprints from the night before were still there. The wind had not erased them. They remained clear in the snow, leading from the trees, straight to the barn, and stopping in the same strange place on the barn floor. Silas had checked the building twice before sunrise. No broken boards. No hidden doors. No place for a man to disappear. Yet someone had been there. Someone real. Across the room, Clara Belle sat quietly at the small table, eating the last of her breakfast. She looked calmer this morning, as if nothing unusual had happened. Silas turned from the window. "Clara," he said gently. The girl looked up. "Would you like to come with me to town today?" She blinked with quiet curiosity. "Town?" Silas nodded. "Yes. We'll buy some supplies, and maybe find someone who knew your father." Clara lowered her eyes slightly. Miss Eliza knew him. Silas tilted his head. "Miss Eliza?" "The schoolteacher," Clara explained softly. "She lives in town." Silas nodded slowly. "Then we'll pay her a visit." Not long after, Silas saddled his horse again. The winter sun climbed slowly into the sky as they rode across the frozen prairie. The land stretched wide and open around them, peaceful and quiet. But Silas could not stop thinking about the footprints, or the stranger who had vanished in his barn, or the way Clara had spoken about her father visiting every night. Something about this mystery did not sit right in his mind. After nearly an hour, the small frontier town came into view. A few wooden buildings lined the dusty road. Smoke drifted from chimneys and townsfolk moved slowly through their morning chores. Silas tied his horse near the general store and helped Clara down. The little girl stayed close beside him as they walked down the street. Some townspeople glanced at them with curiosity. It wasn't often that Silas Whitaker came into town. He was known as a quiet man who kept mostly to himself. Soon they stopped in front of a small white building beside the church. A wooden sign outside read, "Schoolhouse." Children's voices could be heard inside. Silas gently knocked on the door. Moments later it opened. Standing there was a young woman with warm brown eyes and neatly tied hair. She looked surprised when she saw Clara. "Oh my goodness," she whispered. "Clara Belle?" The little girl nodded quietly. "Hello, Miss Eliza." The woman's eyes filled with emotion as she knelt down and wrapped Clara in a careful hug. "I was so worried about you," she said softly. "I didn't know where you had gone." After a moment, the woman stood and looked at Silas. "Thank you for bringing her," she said kindly. "My name is Eliza Hartwell." Silas tipped his hat politely. "Silas Whitaker." Eliza's eyes widened slightly. "The rancher out by the North Prairie?" "That's right." She stepped aside. "Please come in." Inside the small schoolhouse, the children sat quietly reading their lessons. Eliza walked with Silas toward the back of the room so they could speak privately. "I thought Clara might still be at the cabin," she explained softly. "But after the storm last week, I feared the worst." "She was hiding in my barn," Silas said. Eliza frowned with concern. "That poor child." Silas hesitated before asking the question that had been troubling him. "Miss Hartwell, do you know much about Clara's father?" Eliza sighed gently. "Thomas Bell was a good man. Quiet, hard-working." She paused. "But his life became complicated." Silas folded his arms. In what way? Eliza lowered her voice. Thomas had trouble with some dangerous men who passed through this town months ago. Silas's brow tightened. Dangerous how? They believed he had something valuable, Eliza said. Money maybe, or documents. Silas felt a slow uneasiness grow in his chest. Did he? Eliza shook her head. I never knew for certain. She glanced toward Clara, who now sat at a desk drawing quietly with the other children. But after Thomas died, those men came asking questions. Silas looked back at the girl. They never found what they were looking for? Eliza shook her head again. No. Silas thought about the footprints in his barn. And the shadow he had seen in the night. His voice became quieter. What if they're still looking? Eliza's eyes widened slightly. You think someone might be following Clara? Silas nodded slowly. I found footprints at my barn last night. Eliza looked suddenly worried. That child may still be in danger. Silas felt something shift inside him. The ranch had always been quiet, lonely. But now a small girl had come into his life, bringing with her a mystery that someone was willing to risk the cold night to chase. Silas looked toward Clara again. She sat peacefully at the desk, drawing small pictures with a pencil. She looked like any other child. Too small to carry such a heavy secret. Silas turned back to Eliza. I'll keep her safe, he said firmly. Eliza studied him for a moment. Then she smiled gently. I believe you will. Later that afternoon, Silas and Clara rode back toward the ranch. The winter sun began to sink low behind the distant hills. As they reached the yard, Clara looked toward the barn. He'll come again tonight, she whispered. Silas followed her gaze. The barn stood quiet beneath the falling evening shadows. For a moment, the rancher felt that strange chill again. Because now he knew something he hadn't known before. Whoever was visiting the barn at night was not a ghost, was a man. And he was still searching for something hidden in the dark. Waxing crescent moon. Night returned slowly to the prairie. The last light of the sun faded behind the distant hills, and the wide land grew quiet again beneath the cold sky. Inside the ranch house, the fire burned gently in the stone fireplace. Its warm glow filled the small room with soft flickering light. Little Clara Belle sat near the fire, wrapped in the same thick blanket Silas had given her. Across the room, Silas Whitaker sat in his wooden chair, but his eyes were not on the fire tonight. They were on the window. Ever since returning from town, the rancher had been thinking about what Eliza Hartwell had told him. Dangerous men. A secret. Something hidden that someone still wanted to find. And the stranger who had come to the barn in the middle of the night. Silas knew one thing now. Tonight he would not be caught by surprise. He had placed his lantern near the door and his coat close at hand. Outside, the wind moved softly through the dry winter grass. The ranch stood silent beneath the rising moon. Clara watched the fire quietly. Then she spoke in her soft voice. He'll come soon. Silas looked at her. You can tell? She nodded. He always comes when the moon gets high. Silas stood slowly. Well, he said calmly, tonight I'll be ready for him. Clara looked up at him with curious eyes. You're not afraid? Silas gave a small, steady smile. No, he said gently. I just want to know the truth. A little while later, the ranch grew still. The moon climbed higher into the sky, casting pale light across the snow-covered land. Silas dimmed the lantern inside the house and waited. Minutes passed. The fire crackled quietly. Then, a sound, soft, faint, but unmistakable. A slow creak. Silas's eyes moved toward the window. The barn door was moving. Just slightly. The rancher stood immediately. Clara sat up. He's here, she whispered. Silas grabbed his coat and lantern. You stay inside, he told her. Clara nodded, though her eyes remained fixed on the dark yard outside. Silas stepped out into the cold night once again. The air was still and sharp. Moonlight stretched across the ranch like a silver blanket. The barn stood ahead of him, its large wooden door hanging slightly open. Silas walked slowly across the yard, careful not to make too much noise. His boots pressed softly into the snow. As he drew closer to the barn, he saw something move inside. A shadow. Someone was there. Silas lowered the lantern flame slightly and stepped quietly through the door. Inside, the barn smelled of hay and horses. The animals shifted nervously in their stalls. Silas moved deeper into the shadows, listening. Then he heard it. The faint sound of wood scraping against wood. Near the far wall of the barn. Silas moved toward the sound. And then he saw him. A man stood near the back corner, kneeling beside the barn floor. He held a small lantern of his own, its dim light revealing his rough coat and worn hat. The man appeared to be searching the ground carefully, as if looking for something hidden. Silas stepped forward. "That's far enough," he said firmly. The man froze. Slowly he turned around. For a moment, the two men stared at each other across the quiet barn. The stranger's face was shadowed beneath his hat, but his eyes were sharp and wary. "Well now," the man muttered. "I wondered when the rancher might notice." Silas crossed his arms. "You've been sneaking onto my land." The man stood up slowly. "Just looking for something that belongs to me." Silas's voice remained calm but firm. "You won't find it here." The man gave a low chuckle. "Oh, I believe I will." Silas studied him carefully. "Why keep coming at night?" The stranger glanced toward the ranch house outside. "Because of the girl." Silas's eyes hardened. "What about her?" The man tilted his head slightly. "She knows more than she realizes." Silas stepped forward. "You stay away from her." The stranger smiled faintly. "Afraid I can't do that." Suddenly the man grabbed his lantern and rushed toward the open barn door. Silas lunged after him. But the stranger was fast. By the time Silas reached the door, the man had already disappeared into the dark trees beyond the ranch. Silas stood there breathing heavily in the cold night air. The prairie stretched silent around him once again. But now the mystery had become much clearer. Someone was searching for something hidden on his land. And Clarabelle was somehow connected to it. Silas turned and walked back toward the ranch house. Inside, Clara looked up immediately. "You saw him," she said. Silas nodded slowly. "Yes." The girl lowered her eyes. "He comes every night because he's looking for it." Silas knelt beside her. "For what?" Clara looked toward the barn through the dark window. Her voice was quiet but certain. "For what my father hid." Crescent moon? Morning arrived quietly over the ranch once again. Soft sunlight spread slowly across the snowy prairie, turning the white fields into sheets of gold. But inside the ranch house, Silas Whitaker felt no peace. He stood by the window, staring toward the distant tree line where the stranger had disappeared the night before. Now the mystery was no longer just a strange story told by a frightened child. It was real. Someone had been sneaking onto his land, searching the barn in the middle of the night. And that man believed Clarabelle knew something important. Behind him, the small kitchen filled with the gentle sounds of morning. Clara sat at the table eating a piece of warm bread. The fire crackled softly in the fireplace, pushing away the winter chill. For a moment, Silas watched the little girl quietly. She looked so small. Too small to carry secrets that grown men were willing to risk the cold night to chase. Silas walked over and sat across from her. "Clara," he said gently. The girl looked up. "Yes." "Last night you said your father hid something." Clara nodded slowly. Silas leaned forward slightly. "Do you know what it was?" The girl thought for a moment. Then she shook her head. "No." Silas frowned slightly. "Did he ever talk about it?" Clara lowered her eyes toward the table. "He told me not to tell anyone." Silas's voice remained calm. "But you don't remember what it was?" Clara hesitated. Then she whispered quietly. "I remember he was scared." Silas waited patiently. "One night," Clara continued, "some men came to the cabin." Silas's attention sharpened. "What happened?" Clara's small fingers tightened around her cup. "They were angry. They wanted something from my father." Silas felt the pieces of the story slowly coming together. "And your father refused?" Clara nodded. "He told them it didn't belong to them." The room fell silent for a moment. The fire cracked softly behind them. Silas stood up. "We should visit town again today." Clara looked surprised. "Why?" "There might be someone who knows more about your father." Later that morning, they rode once again across the wide winter prairie toward the small frontier town. The cold air brushed against their faces as the horse moved steadily along the frozen trail. Silas's mind worked carefully through everything he had learned. A frightened father. Dangerous men searching for something valuable. And now a stranger still looking for it months later. By the time they reached town, the streets had begun to fill with people starting their day. Silas tied his horse near the sheriff's office. The wooden building stood beside the general store, its faded sign swinging gently in the cold wind. Inside, the sheriff looked up from his desk. He was a large man with gray hair and tired eyes. "Well now," the sheriff said. "Silas Whitaker. Don't see you in here very often." Silas removed his hat. "Morning, Sheriff." The sheriff noticed Clara standing beside him. His face softened. "Well, I'll be." Clara Bell. Clara nodded quietly. Hello, Sheriff. The sheriff leaned back in his chair. I heard you've been found safe. Silas stepped forward. I need to ask you about her father. The sheriff's expression grew more serious. Thomas Bell? That's right. The sheriff sighed and folded his hands on the desk. Good man, he said slowly. But he got mixed up in something bigger than he should have. Silas waited. A group of outlaws passed through town last year, the sheriff explained. They robbed a stagecoach carrying important papers and money. Silas's brow tightened. And Thomas Bell? The sheriff nodded. He found something those men lost. Silas felt his heartbeat slow. What kind of thing? The sheriff leaned closer. Documents. Important ones. Silas glanced at Clara. What kind of documents? The sheriff lowered his voice. Proof that those men were working with a crooked land dealer. Silas understood immediately. Evidence. Something powerful enough to put dangerous men in prison. The sheriff continued. Thomas planned to bring the papers to me, but before he could. The sheriff paused sadly. He died. Silas looked toward Clara again. The girl stood quietly beside him, listening. And the papers? Silas asked. The sheriff shook his head. Never found them. Silas felt the final piece fall into place. They're hidden somewhere. The sheriff nodded. That's what those men believe. Silas thought about the stranger digging through his barn. The man searching night after night. Someone's still looking, Silas said quietly. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. You've seen someone? Silas nodded. Last night. The sheriff stood up immediately. Well then, he said firmly. We'd better find those papers before the wrong man does. Later that afternoon, Silas and Clara rode back toward the ranch once again. The sun dipped low behind the distant hills, painting the prairie in warm golden light. As the ranch house came into view, Clara suddenly spoke. My father told me something once. Silas looked down at her. What was that? The girl stared toward the barn. Her voice was soft but certain. He said if anything happened to him, the truth would still be safe. Silas followed her gaze. The barn stood quietly in the fading light. But now the rancher knew something important. The stranger was not searching for money. He was searching for the truth. And that truth was hidden somewhere on Silas Whitaker's land. Sunrise. Night fell once again over the wide prairie. The snow that had coated the ranch during the last storm had begun to melt slightly, leaving icy patches along the yard and tracks from earlier days still visible. Inside the small cabin, Silas Whitaker moved quietly. The fire had burned low hours ago, leaving only soft embers glowing in the hearth. Clara Bell lay under her blanket, exhausted from the day's journey to town and back. But her eyes were heavy with curiosity, and Silas knew she hadn't truly slept. Tonight he would not leave the mystery of the barn unsolved. He had waited. Watch. Listen. And now he had decided to confront whatever, or whoever, was disturbing the quiet of his ranch. Silas lifted his lantern and stepped outside. The prairie stretched silent under the moonlight, the cold air sharp against his face. He moved toward the barn slowly, boots crunching in the snow. The barn door creaked slightly as he pushed it open, revealing the familiar scent of hay and horses. He climbed the ladder carefully into the loft, lantern held high. The moonlight streamed through gaps in the wooden planks, casting pale, ghostly lines across the hay. Silas's eyes scanned the space. Then he saw it, a small wooden floorboard near the back corner of the loft, slightly raised. He knelt, testing it with his hand. Moved. Someone had been hiding something here. Silas's heartbeat quickened. He reached down and pried the board up carefully. Beneath it lay a small dust-covered wooden box. He lifted it slowly, brushing the snow and debris away. The box was light but heavy with the weight of its contents. Silas opened it. Inside were several letters, folded neatly, tied with string. The edges were yellowed and worn with age. A journal sat beneath them. He picked up the first letter and read aloud softly. If you are reading this, it means I am gone. But the truth must be kept safe. The men who seek it are dangerous, but justice must be done. Silas felt a chill run down his spine. Clara's voice broke the silence. You found it, she whispered. Silas looked down at her. She had climbed the ladder silently, her small hands gripping the hay for balance. Yes, he said, holding the box toward her. Your father tried to protect something important. The girl's eyes filled with wonder. She reached out and touched the letters, running her fingers lightly over the worn string. He wanted me to be safe, she said softly, almost to herself. Silas knelt beside her. "And now you are," he said gently. "But we must be careful. Someone still might be looking for this." Outside, the prairie was quiet, but the memory of the shadow that had haunted the barn the previous nights pressed heavily in Silas's mind. Whoever had been sneaking around the ranch had not yet given up. He looked down at Clara. "Your father trusted you to keep the truth," he said. "And I will make sure no harm comes to you while it is here." Clara nodded slowly, eyes shining. "And maybe," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "he really does watch over me even now." Silas glanced toward the moonlit sky. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps her father's spirit lingered, guiding her through the darkness. He closed the box gently and set it aside in a safe corner of the loft, hidden beneath the hay. For the first time in days, Silas felt a small measure of hope. But he knew the danger was not over. Somewhere out there, someone still wanted what Clara's father had protected. And soon, they would come back. Crescent moon. Night was deeper than ever. The prairie stretched endlessly under the pale moonlight, silvered and quiet, yet heavy with secrets. Inside the cabin, Clara Belle lay under her blanket, restless. Her small hands clutched the quilt tightly as her mind turned over the events of the last few nights. She remembered the stranger, his shadow in the barn, the footprints in the snow, and now the box her father had hidden. Silas Whitaker sat near the fire, reading through the letters in the journal. His face was serious, his eyes scanning every line with care. Each letter contained the careful warnings of Thomas Bell, the man who had given everything to keep the truth safe. One line struck Silas particularly. "If they find what I hid, they will stop at nothing. Protect her at all costs." The words pressed on him like a weight he could not set down. Suddenly Clara stirred. "Silas," she whispered. "I think he's back." The rancher's eyes narrowed. He had felt it too, the subtle shift in the cold wind outside. A presence. Watching. Waiting. He rose quietly and picked up his lantern. His boots pressed softly into the wooden floor as he moved toward the door. Outside, the prairie was silent. The snow glimmered under the moon, untouched except for one set of footprints, large, deliberate, leading toward the barn. Silas's jaw tightened. He followed the prints, lantern in hand, careful not to alert the intruder. The barn door stood slightly ajar, swaying gently in the night breeze. He stepped inside. The air smelled of hay and cold metal. Every shadow seemed alive. Then he saw movement near the loft ladder. A tall figure paused, turning slowly to face him. The stranger's hat shadowed his eyes and his hands were empty, but his intent was clear. "You again?" Silas said firmly. The man's voice was low and cold. "I told you, the papers belong to me." Silas's grip on the lantern tightened. "They don't belong to you. They belong to the truth, and I will protect this child." The stranger stepped closer, a flicker of menace in his eyes. The barn seemed to shrink around them, the only sounds the horses' uneasy shuffles and the wind whispering through cracks in the wood. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then, as if sensing Silas's determination, the stranger took a step back, his eyes lingering on the box hidden beneath the hay in the loft. "You may think you're safe," the man said, his voice almost a hiss. "But the night is not over. I will return." Before Silas could respond, the man vanished into the darkness outside. The wind carried the sound of his footsteps across the snow. Silas exhaled slowly, lantern light trembling in his hand. He turned toward Clara, who had quietly followed him to the barn doorway. "They won't stop," she whispered, voice small. Silas pulled her close. "No," he said softly. "But neither will we." He helped her back to the cabin, carrying the box with him this time. Every shadow, every whisper of the wind reminded him that danger was near, but so was hope. As the fire crackled gently, Silas and Clara sat in silence. The child pressed close, comforted by the rancher's steady presence. Outside, the prairie lay quiet. The snow reflected the moon's silver light, and the distant tree line cast long dark shadows. Somewhere in those shadows, the stranger waited. But Silas Whitaker knew one thing for certain. He would not let anyone harm Clara, nor take the truth her father had hidden. Crescent moon. The night arrived heavy and still. The prairie lay under a thick blanket of frost, silent except for the occasional creak of distant trees. The moon shone pale and cold, painting the ranch in silver shadows. Inside the cabin, Silas Whitaker was awake, sitting near the fire, staring at the wooden box hidden safely beneath the table. Clara Belle slept beside him, her small hands clutching the quilt, unaware of the danger that still lurked outside. Silas had been preparing all day. He had checked the barn, reinforced the doors, and moved the horses closer to the stable walls. Tonight he would not be caught unprepared. The first sound came as a soft crunch in the snow. Silas froze. He recognized it immediately: footsteps. He grabbed his lantern and moved quietly toward the door. The wind had shifted, the smell of smoke and cold air drifted faintly in. The stranger had returned. Silas stepped outside, boots pressing into the snow. His lantern cast long, trembling shadows across the yard. The barn door was slightly open. The footprints leading to it were fresh, deep, deliberate. Silas gripped the lantern tighter and moved forward. Inside, the barn smelled of hay and the cold bite of winter. Every creak of the wooden beams made him tense. Then the figure appeared. The stranger stepped into the lantern light, face shadowed beneath his hat. But tonight, Silas noticed something different. The stranger looked tired, wary, as if the weight of the chase had begun to wear on him. "You shouldn't have come," the man said, voice low and sharp. "I told you," Silas said firmly. "This child and her father's truth are under my protection. You won't take them." The man's eyes flicked toward the loft. "You don't know what's at stake," he said. "Those papers could ruin lives, powerful men. And you think hiding them in a barn will stop anyone?" Silas stepped forward. His voice was steady, calm, unwavering. "It will stop you. Because I won't let harm come to her. Not tonight. Not ever." The stranger hesitated. For the first time, Silas saw uncertainty in the man's eyes. Then slowly he reached toward his coat. But before he could move further, a voice called out from the cabin. "Silas, he's coming inside." It was Clara. Her small voice rang sharp against the quiet night. The stranger turned instinctively, giving Silas the opening he had been waiting for. With careful speed, Silas moved to block him from the loft and the hidden box beneath the hay. A tense silence fell. The stranger realized he could not reach the papers without facing Silas directly. He looked around, trapped between the determined rancher and the walls of the barn. Finally, the man's shoulders slumped. He raised his hands slowly. "You win," he said quietly. I just wanted the truth." Silas lowered the lantern slightly, watching him carefully. "The truth?" Silas repeated. "Then listen. Those letters, those papers, they are not for you. They are to protect the innocent. Your pursuit has already caused enough fear. Step away from them." The stranger nodded slowly, his gaze flicking toward the loft where the wooden box sat hidden. Then he turned and walked toward the door. Outside, the prairie was cold and silent. The man disappeared into the shadows of the trees, leaving only the faintest imprint of footprints in the snow. Silas stood in the barn doorway, lantern shaking slightly in his hand. He exhaled slowly, letting the tension ease from his shoulders. He moved back toward the cabin, carrying the box with him. Inside, Clara waited, eyes wide. "You were brave," she whispered softly. Silas knelt beside her. "No," he said gently. "We were brave together." Clara looked toward the fire, then back at the box. "The truth is safe," Silas said softly. "And so are you." The prairie outside lay calm beneath the moonlight. The wind had died down, leaving only the faint sound of the snow settling across the wide, silent land. For the first time in many nights, Silas Whitaker felt a quiet hope. The danger had passed, for now. But he knew one thing: some truths were worth protecting no matter the cost. Crescent moon. The first light of morning spilled gently across the prairie. Soft golden rays touched the snow, melting the frost into sparkling droplets. The world seemed quiet, peaceful, as if the long winter night had finally released its hold. Inside the cabin, Clara Bell stirred beneath her blanket. Her small face was calm, her dark eyes wide and thoughtful. For the first time in many nights she felt safe. Silas Whitaker sat in his chair near the fire, the wooden box still resting on the table beside him. The letters, the journal, and the folded papers lay neatly within, their secrets finally secured. The danger had passed, the shadow of the stranger gone with the fading moon. Clara climbed carefully into Silas's lap, resting her head against his shoulder. "Silas," she whispered softly, "do you think my father would be proud?" Silas looked down at her small face, brushing a strand of hair from her eyes. "He would be very proud," he said gently. "You kept the truth safe. And you trusted the right person to help you. That is something to honor." Clara smiled faintly. A small warmth blossomed in her chest. She had lost so much, faced so many nights of fear, but now she felt the beginnings of hope. Outside, the ranch stretched wide and open. The snow glimmered under the morning sun. The barn stood quietly, a sentinel of the past and the secrets it had protected. The prairie seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, the wind whispering softly through the trees. Silas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the land he had called home for so many years. This ranch had always been quiet, lonely, but now, with Clara here, it felt alive with purpose. The little girl climbed down and walked beside him. Her small hand found his, and for the first time in many nights, Silas felt the weight of responsibility lift slightly. "Will it always be safe?" Clara asked, looking up at him with trust in her eyes. Silas knelt beside her, holding both of her small hands in his. "As long as I'm here," he said firmly, "you will always be safe." The two of them stood quietly together for a moment, listening to the soft sounds of the prairie waking around them. Somewhere far off, a lone bird called across the open land. The wind carried the scent of pine and fresh snow, and the wide horizon promised a future unshaken by fear. Clara looked up at Silas and smiled, a real bright smile that lit her entire face. "Then, maybe my father really is watching over me," she said softly. Silas nodded, his eyes glistening slightly. "I believe he is," he said. Together they walked toward the barn. The wooden box remained safely hidden beneath the loft hay, its secrets protected by courage, love, and the quiet strength of a small girl and the man who had chosen to stand beside her. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting warm light across the ranch. Snow glimmered like diamonds, the prairie stretching endlessly into the distance. And for the first time in many long months, the ranch was no longer a place of fear or shadow. It was a home. A home filled with trust, hope, and the promise of new beginnings. Clara turned to Silas, her small hand brushing against his arm. "Thank you," she whispered. Silas smiled, his voice steady and warm. "No, thank you, Clara. You reminded me what it means to protect someone with everything you have. And what it means to have hope, even when the night is darkest." The prairie stretched on, vast and open, full of life and quiet promise. And the morning light touched the cabin, the barn, and the little girl who had survived so much, finally bringing the story of courage, love, and faith to its peaceful close. For on this ranch, under the wide sky and gentle sun, they were home. Sunrise.